Comrades, hear me now. The most insidious chains are not those that clatter upon your wrists, nor the bars that imprison your body. No, the chains that bind you most tightly are those that lie unseen, that wrap around your mind and spirit, that masquerade as freedom while demanding your obedience. You labor, you sweat, you toil, not for yourselves, but for a system that extracts your life, your dignity, your very humanity, and calls it progress. These chains are invisible because they're embedded in the very structure of society, in the so-called laws of the market, in the illusions of merit and individualism, in the quiet whispers that tell you, if you fail, it is your fault. Yet, let us expose the truth, for truth is the hammer that shatters illusions. Capitalism, in its cunning, has rendered your chains imperceptible. It tells you to work harder, to compete, to climb a ladder whose top is reserved for a select few, while the rest are left to struggle for crumbs. Every hour you labor beyond necessity, every ounce of creativity you offer, is appropriated without acknowledgement, without compensation, as profit. That accumulation of wealth does not arise from magic. It is the unpaid labor of the many exploited by the few. You are told this is fair, this is natural, this is inevitable. But it is neither fair nor natural nor inevitable. It is organized theft, systemic oppression, and it is your chains. Consider the factory, the office, the shop, the farm. Consider the places where you exchange your life for a wage. You are alienated from the product of your labor, from the act of labor itself, from your fellow workers, and ultimately from your own human essence. You do not own what you create. You do not see its purpose beyond profit. You do not recognize your own value because the system tells you that value is measured in money, not in human life. The chains are subtle. They are the normalized exploitation, the unchallenged hierarchy, the hidden coercion of economic dependence. And so long as these chains remain invisible, you are shackled even more tightly than if you were in an open prison. But recognize this: chains are broken not by submission, but by consciousness. To see your oppression is to see the possibility of liberation. The history of all hitherto existing society is the history of class struggles, Marx wrote, and today the struggle is yours. The worker and the oppressed, the peasant and the laborer, the marginalized and the silenced, all of you who are made to believe that your toil is your destiny, you hold the power to end this exploitation. The collective strength of the many outweighs the power of the few. Your chains cannot withstand unity. They cannot withstand organization. They cannot withstand revolt. Rise, therefore, with eyes unclouded by ideology and hearts unshaken by fear. Understand that your individual suffering is not an accident, but a product of a system designed to benefit the few at the expense of the many. To rise is not merely to demand better wages, not merely to ask for reforms, but to challenge the very foundations of ownership, of production, of society itself. Seize control of the instruments of labor, the sources of wealth, and place them in the hands of those who create them. Reclaim your humanity, your time, your purpose, and your dignity. Know this: the ruling class fears the awakening of the masses more than anything else, because when the blind chains of ideology are lifted from your minds, no fortress, no law, no army can hold back the tide of the people united. Solidarity is the spark. Class consciousness is the fire. Revolution is the inevitable outcome when those who produce unite against those who profit from their exploitation. The invisible chains crumble when you no longer consent to wear them. Comrades, the chains you cannot see are the ones that bind you the most. But they can also be shattered by the vision of collective liberation, by the courage to organize, by the refusal to accept a life measured in labor rather than in freedom. The time to awaken is now. The time to unite is now. The time to claim what is rightfully yours, the wealth you produce, the life you deserve, the society you can build, is now. Do not be deceived. No reform will liberate you. No charity will free you. No ruling power will grant you equality. You must seize it with your own hands, with your own minds, and with your united strength. Let us rise, therefore, not as isolated individuals, but as a class, as a movement, as the force that history itself demands. Let us break the chains that are unseen, untangle the web of exploitation, and construct a society where labor serves life, not profit, where humanity is valued above wealth, where freedom is not a privilege of the few, but the birthright of all. Comrades, recognize your oppression, unite in your struggle, and act with the courage of those who will not be bound any longer. The invisible chains can be seen, understood, and destroyed. And when they fall, history will remember that it was the consciousness and action of the many that shattered the power of the few. Invisible chains bind us in, ways that are far more insidious than iron or steel ever could. They do not clank or rattle, nor do they leave bruises or cuts, yet their weight is felt in every thought, every action, and every choice imposed upon the working class. These chains are composed of ideology, of the assumptions and beliefs that society feeds to each individual, convincing us that our position in the hierarchy is natural, deserved, or unchangeable. We are told to compete with one another, to strive endlessly for success, and to blame ourselves when we fail, as if our struggles are the product of personal weakness rather than the structural forces that govern our lives. This is the essence of the invisible chain. It convinces us that our oppression is voluntary, our exploitation justified, and our subjugation inevitable. From birth, the worker is taught to accept the rules of a system designed not for liberation but for profit, to internalize the notion that value is measured in money rather than labor, and that happiness is found in consumption rather than creation. Economic dependence compounds this ideological control. The worker exchanges hours of life for a wage that is never enough to grant freedom, only survival. Every paycheck comes with invisible strings, the need to pay rent, to feed a family, to meet debts, and to maintain a standard that the system itself enforces. This dependence on the capitalist structure forces compliance, shapes behavior, and conditions thought. Even when the worker grows aware of the injustices, the fear of losing livelihood restrains action, reinforcing the chains that remain unseen yet ever present. The illusion of choice pervades daily life. Where to live, what to buy, how to spend free time, but all of it occurs within boundaries dictated by economic necessity, boundaries that obscure the reality of exploitation. These are not choices freely made. They are adaptations to a system that thrives on labor extracted without proportional reward. The ideology that accompanies economic dependence is subtle but pervasive. It manifests in education that teaches obedience and competitiveness, media that celebrates consumption and conformity, and social norms that valorize individual advancement over collective welfare. The worker internalizes the belief that meritocracy governs society, that hard work inevitably leads to success, and that failure signifies moral or intellectual deficiency. In reality, these ideas mask the underlying economic relations that concentrate wealth and power in the hands of a few, while the majority contribute the labor that sustains the system. Every promotion, every token reward, Every minor concession offered by employers acts as a salve, a distraction from the structural exploitation that continues unabated. The chains are invisible precisely because they are woven into the fabric of everyday life, normalized to the point where questioning them feels unnatural or rebellious. The consequences of these invisible chains are profound. The worker becomes alienated from the product of labor, from the process of labor itself, and from fellow workers. Creativity and skill are reduced to mechanical output. Human relationships are mediated by competition, and self-worth is measured by one's ability to survive within the economic framework rather than by one's capacity to create, think, or contribute to collective life. Ideology masks this alienation as individual failure, blaming the victim for systemic oppression, and thus deepens the chain's hold. Each worker, isolated and dependent, is easier to control, less able to recognize solidarity, and more likely to accept conditions that perpetuate exploitation. The psychological weight of the invisible chain is immense. It stifles imagination, dampens dissent, and conditions the mind to see hierarchy and inequality as immutable. Yet recognition of these chains is the first step toward liberation. Understanding that one's limitations are not inherent but imposed allows consciousness to break the spell of ideological domination. Seeing the patterns of economic dependence exposes the ways in which life, labor, and freedom have been systematically constrained. The invisible chains, once identified, can be addressed collectively, for they rely on the complicity of those who are divided and isolated. Only by understanding the structural nature of oppression can workers begin to resist, organize, and reclaim control over their labor, their communities, and their destinies. Awareness of the invisible chains awakens the mind to the possibility that society can be reorganized, that the conditions of dependence can be overturned, and that true human freedom is attainable when the power that exploits labor is challenged and dismantled. Economic dependence and ideological conditioning work together to ensure compliance. The worker is taught to see scarcity, insecurity, and competition as the natural order, while the benefits of cooperation, solidarity, and collective action are obscured. These invisible chains are reinforced by legal structures, cultural narratives, and economic pressures, creating a system that traps the majority in cycles of survival rather than self-determination. The more entrenched these chains, the more difficult it seems to imagine a world beyond them, and yet this difficulty is precisely what makes the awakening necessary. Once recognized, the chains reveal not only the nature of the oppression, but also the potential for resistance, for collective organization, and for the creation of a society where labor serves human needs rather than profit. Capitalism, at its very core, is a system designed to turn human labor into a commodity, to convert the creativity, energy, and effort of the worker into profit for those who own the means of production. It presents itself as a natural order, as a system of opportunity and fairness. Yet its mechanisms are rooted in exploitation, extraction, and alienation. The worker labors not for the fulfillment of their own needs, nor for the cultivation of their talents, but to generate surplus value for the capitalist. Every hour worked, every idea produced, every drop of sweat shed becomes the property of the owner, who reaps the rewards while the worker receives only a fraction of the value they create. This unpaid toil is not a small injustice, but the very foundation upon which the wealth of the few rests. The capitalist does not simply purchase labor. The system is structured so that labor itself produces more than it is compensated for, creating profit that is appropriated entirely by those who control production. The extraction of profit from labor is not a marginal feature of capitalism, it is its lifeblood. The capitalist system thrives on this imbalance, on the asymmetry between those who create and those who consume the fruits of creation. Workers are compelled to sell their labor in order to survive, trapped by necessity and constrained by the economic pressures imposed by rent, debt, and the cost of living. Their labor becomes a form of bondage, their time a resource harvested for the benefit of others. The wages they receive are designed to keep them alive and productive, but never to grant true freedom or satisfaction. In this way, capitalism systematically converts human potential into a source of profit, transforming creative and social energy into a mechanism for accumulation. Alienation is the inevitable companion to this exploitation. Workers are separated from the product of their labor, what they produce below. NGS not to them but to the capitalist, to be sold, consumed, or accumulated as wealth. The worker has no control over the form, purpose, or use of their labor. They are reduced to a cog in a machine, performing repetitive tasks with no meaningful connection to the outcomes of their effort. In this process, human creativity and skill are reduced to mechanical movements that serve the market, rather than the worker's own human needs. Labor, which should be an expression of humanity, becomes instead an instrument of oppression, stripping the worker of autonomy, dignity, and a sense of purpose. Furthermore, capitalism alienates workers from themselves. When the value of one's existence is measured not by contribution to society or fulfillment of human potential, but by the ability to survive economically, the worker's sense of self becomes externally defined. Identity and worth are tied to productivity, to efficiency, to profitability, rather than to intrinsic human capacities. The worker comes to see themselves as a means rather than an end, as a tool to be utilized rather than a being with needs, desires, and creative potential. This internalized subjugation is a powerful form of control, ensuring that the worker not only accepts exploitation but perceives it as natural and inevitable. Alienation extends beyond the individual to relationships among workers. Competition is fostered at every level, for wages, for promotions, for survival within the labor market. Solidarity is undermined by a system that positions workers against one another, discouraging collective resistance and emphasizing personal advancement over communal well-being. Friendships, family, and community are strained by the pressures of work and economic insecurity, while the worker is continually reminded that their value is contingent upon their labor rather than their humanity. The system thus corrodes both the individual and social bonds, replacing authentic connections with calculated interactions that serve the interests of capital. The capitalist mode of production also imposes alienation through the commodification of time and experience. Leisure is subordinated to labor, rest is framed as secondary to productivity, and creativity outside of work is constrained by exhaustion and the economic necessity to continue selling labor. Even personal desires, cultural expression, and intellectual pursuits are conditioned by the structures of consumption and commodification. The worker is forced to live in a world where everything, including themselves, is evaluated through the lens of market value. In this way, capitalism not only extracts surplus labor, but reshapes the very consciousness of the worker, aligning thoughts, habits, and aspirations with the needs of accumulation rather than human flourishing. Yet the system's exploitation is neither invisible nor immutable. It can be recognized, analyzed, and resisted. Understanding that profit is generated by unpaid labor exposes the fundamental injustice of capitalism. It reveals that the alienation experienced by workers, the disconnection from their products, from their own creative capacities, from each other, and from themselves, is not a personal failing but a structural consequence of an economic system designed to prioritize capital over human life. Knowledge of this exploitation is the first step toward organizing, uniting, and reclaiming control over labor, production, and society itself, opening the possibility for a world in which labor serves life and not profit, and where humanity is restored in place of alienation. The more workers recognize the extraction of surplus value and the alienation it produces, the more they can unite to challenge it. Awareness transforms oppression into action, and collective consciousness becomes the instrument through which exploitation can be overturned. Capitalism relies on the invisibility of this extraction and alienation to perpetuate itself. Yet once understood, its mechanisms can be resisted, contested, and dismantled through solidarity, organization, and a shared commitment to human liberation rather than private accumulation. Class consciousness is the awakening of the mind to the realities that have been hidden by ideology, by tradition, and by the very structures that benefit from oppression. It is the recognition that one's struggles are not personal failures, isolated misfortunes, or the result of moral weakness, but rather the inevitable outcomes of a social and economic system designed to extract labor, enforce inequality, and concentrate wealth in the hands of a few. To develop class consciousness is to see beyond the surface of daily life, beyond the individual crises of survival, and to perceive the structural forces that govern existence, shaping who suffers, who profits, and who holds power. Who holds power. It is to understand that systemic oppression is not accidental, that the hierarchies of society are maintained deliberately, and that they are reinforced through law, culture, and the coercion of economic dependence. Without this awareness, the worker remains isolated, manipulated, and unable to act in unison with others who share similar conditions. The recognition of systemic oppression requires clarity of thought and courage of perception. It demands the rejection of narratives that tell the individual they are at fault for their poverty, their insecurity, or their lack of opportunity. The system does not reward merit so much as it rewards ownership, so much as it rewards those who already possess the means to extract value from labor. Understanding this is essential because the illusions of personal blame obscure the collective reality of exploitation. The worker may struggle alone, believing that hard work or moral fortitude will secure freedom while the underlying structures continue to operate, harvesting labor, extracting profit, and perpetuating alienation. Class consciousness pierces this illusion by revealing that survival and deprivation are determined less by personal choices than by one's position within the hierarchy of production and property. Systemic oppression manifests in multiple ways. It is economic, political, social, and cultural. The worker's labor is commodified, wages are minimized relative to the value created, and the surplus benefits the owner rather than the producer. Laws, ostensibly neutral, protect property over people and enforce the existing distribution of wealth. Culture and media celebrate individualism, consumption, and competition, masking the collective nature of exploitation and discouraging solidarity. Education, in many cases, trains the mind to accept hierarchy, to see obedience as virtue, and to view the market as a natural arbiter of value. All of these forces combine to maintain the invisibility of oppression, to normalize inequality, and to convince the oppressed that their condition is a personal circumstance rather than a systemic one. Recognition of these structures, therefore, is revolutionary because it overturns the illusions that have been imposed on the workers' consciousness and reframes the struggle as one of collective liberation rather than individual survival. The awakening of class consciousness is inseparable from solidarity. One cannot fully comprehend oppression in isolation because the system thrives on division. Workers are pitted against one another through competition, cultural differences, or the promise of incremental rewards, weakening their collective potential. Recognizing systemic oppression clarifies that the struggle is not against other workers, but against the structures and individuals who profit from division. Once consciousness is shared, the bonds of solidarity strengthen, revealing the collective power inherent in those who create society's wealth. It is in this unity that the potential for organized resistance emerges as individuals understand that their fate is intertwined and that only by acting together can they challenge entrenched power. The first step toward liberation is the refusal to internalize the logic of exploitation. When the worker recognizes that oppression is systemic, that the chains are maintained not by personal inadequacy, but by deliberate economic and social structures, they cease to accept subordination as inevitable. This recognition transforms perception into action. Labor is no longer a passive activity, but a site of struggle where consciousness meets collective organization. Class consciousness provides the intellectual foundation for revolutionary action, for it illuminates both the nature of oppression and the means by which it can be resisted. The worker begins to see their labor as a weapon, their solidarity as strength, and their collective efforts as capable of transforming society itself. Education, dialogue, and critical reflection are essential tools in the development of class consciousness. Workers must examine the patterns of wealth and power, the historical roots of inequality, and the ways in which ideology sustains oppression. They must understand that the laws, norms, and values they have been taught are often instruments of control, designed to maintain the status quo and to prevent unified action. Recognizing this does not merely provide intellectual clarity, it cultivates moral and political courage, empowering workers to confront exploitation directly rather than resigning themselves to its inevitability. The awareness of systemic oppression also allows the worker to anticipate and resist the tactics of the ruling class, who rely on deception, co-optation, and fragmentation to maintain dominance. By developing class consciousness, workers see through false promises, recognize when reforms are designed to pacify rather than liberate, and identify opportunities to build enduring collective power. Knowledge of oppression becomes a source of strength, revealing both the mechanisms of exploitation and the pathways toward emancipation. Thus, class consciousness is both the lens and the spark of liberation. It transforms the worker from a passive participant in exploitation into an active agent of change, capable of understanding the structures that bind them, organizing with others who share the same conditions, and asserting collective power to reclaim human dignity, justice, and freedom. Recognition of systemic oppression is not merely intellectual. It is the foundation for action, is not merely intellectual, the first step in the journey from subjugation to emancipation, and the essential precondition for any meaningful revolution that seeks to overturn exploitation and restore humanity to labor. The power of the many is the only force capable of confronting the entrenched power of the few. Individual effort, no matter how diligent or courageous, is insufficient to overturn a system built on the systematic extraction of labor and the concentration of wealth. Capitalism depends on division. It thrives on isolation, on the belief that each worker must struggle alone for survival, pitting one against another in competition for scarce resources and incremental rewards. The system is designed to prevent collective understanding, to fracture solidarity, and to maintain the illusion that inequality is a product of personal failure rather than structural oppression. Only through unity can the oppressed redo. Cognize their shared conditions, their common interests, and the inherent strength that comes from organizing collectively. It is not merely desirable but necessary for survival, for liberation, and for the establishment of a society where labor serves human needs rather than private profit. Collective organization begins with awareness, with the recognition that oppression is systemic, and that power is concentrated in the hands of those who own the means of production. It is through shared understanding that workers can see beyond the false narratives of meritocracy, competition, and individual blame. When the oppressed come together to identify the mechanisms by which wealth is extracted, labor is exploited, and freedom is constrained, they lay the foundation for solidarity. Solidarity is not a sentiment or a fleeting emotion. It is an active commitment to mutual support, to collective struggle, and to the belief that the liberation of one is bound to the liberation of all. Without it, exploitation continues unchallenged because divided workers are powerless against the coordinated interests of capital. The history of class struggle demonstrates that change does not arise from appeals to morality or the benevolence of the ruling class. Reform, charity, or concessions are temporary and insufficient. They are given to preserve order, to prevent uprising, and to sustain the very system that oppresses. Only the collective action of those who produce wealth, who labor under conditions of deprivation and alienation, can confront the structures that exploit them. When workers unite, they convert the power of production into a tool for emancipation, showing that labor itself is the source of all wealth, and that its control must lie in the hands of those who create it. Through collective organization, the oppressed transform from isolated victims into a force capable of challenging hierarchies, reshaping institutions, and asserting control over the means of life. Unity also creates resilience against the tactics of the ruling class, who employ division, co-optation, and intimidation to maintain dominance. Capitalists know that organized workers threaten their profits and power, and they respond with measures designed to disrupt solidarity. Wage differentials, competition for scarce employment, propaganda, and laws that criminalize collective action. These tactics are effective only when workers are isolated and unaware of their collective strength. When solidarity is forged, these tactics lose their potency, because workers act not as fragmented individuals, but as an interconnected force capable of negotiation, resistance, and, if necessary, revolution. Collective action transforms the very dynamics of power, shifting it from a small elite to the masses whose labor sustains society. Organizing collectively is not merely a strategic choice. It is a moral and political imperative. It is the recognition that the chains imposed upon the oppressed are broken not by the will of a single individual, but by coordinated effort, by the pooling of resources, by the conscious application of strength in unity. Strikes, assemblies, labor unions, cooperatives, and revolutionary movements all exemplify the ways in which collective organization enables workers to assert their rights, demand justice, and reclaim the wealth they produce. These actions demonstrate that solidarity is not theoretical. It is tangible, concrete, and transformative. Through organization, the oppressed gain the capacity to negotiate power, resist exploitation, and restructure society in alignment with human needs rather than the profit of a few. Moreover, unity fosters consciousness, understanding, and purpose. When workers organize together, they exchange ideas, recognize had experiences of exploitation, and build strategies for resistance. This process deepens awareness of systemic oppression and reinforces the moral legitimacy of the struggle. Collective deliberation and coordinated action ensure that resistance is not haphazard, but deliberate, not reactive, but strategic. The bonds formed through solidarity are both practical and ideological, providing the foundation for sustained action that can challenge entrenched hierarchies, disrupt the mechanisms of exploitation, and lay the groundwork for societal transformation. The oppressed cannot rely on benevolence, reform, or charity to achieve liberation. They cannot depend on the goodwill of those whose wealth is derived from their labor. The path to freedom lies through collective action, through the conscious recognition of shared conditions, and through the deliberate organization of workers as a class. Unity is the instrument by which exploitation is confronted. Alienation is overcome, and labor is restored to its proper place as the source of wealth, creativity, and human fulfillment. In solidarity, the oppressed find both strength and strategy, turning the power of the many into the force that can challenge the few and reshape society itself. True freedom is not the ability to consume more, to accumulate status, or to compete within the constraints of a system designed to benefit the few. It is the power to shape one's life, to determine the purpose of one's labor, and to participate in a society where human needs, dignity, and creativity take precedence over the insatiable pursuit of profit. Under capitalism, the worker labors not for fulfillment, not for the satisfaction of social or personal needs, but to produce value that is appropriated by those who control the means of production. Wealth is concentrated in the hands of a few, while the vast majority remain dependent, alienated and constrained, their lives dictated by the imperatives of the market. True freedom, therefore, requires a radical transformation of ownership and control, a seizure of the instruments of production so that those who create society's wealth determine its use, distribution, and purpose. Seizing control of production is not simply a matter of acquiring factories, machines, or resources. It is the reclamation of labor itself, the recognition that the wealth of society is generated collectively by those who toil, think, and create. Every product, every service, every innovation arises from human effort, and yet the capitalist system strips workers of ownership and authority over what they produce. By taking control of production, the workers dissolve the structures that enable exploitation, redirecting resources and labor to serve human life rather than private accumulation. Production becomes an instrument of liberation rather than subjugation, a tool to meet the needs of communities rather than the whims of profit. In this way, economic activity is no longer an end in itself, but a means of enhancing human potential, well-being, and collective prosperity. A society oriented toward human needs, rather than profit, requires the transformation of values, priorities, and goals. Capitalism equates value with market exchange, placing wealth, efficiency, and competitiveness above human welfare. Time, energy, and creativity are harnessed to generate surplus value, not to improve the quality of life, enrich human relationships, or cultivate knowledge and culture. In contrast, a society guided by human needs evaluates wealth in terms of health, education, security, and freedom. Production is organized to satisfy the necessities of life, to nurture potential, and to eliminate deprivation. Labor ceases to be a source of alienation and becomes an expression of human capacity. A creative act that strengthens both individual and collective existence. Freed from the dictates of profit, workers can prioritize innovation, cooperation, and sustainable practices, aligning economic activity with the flourishing of people and communities. The transition to such a society cannot occur without conscious, collective effort. The seizure of production is inherently political as well as economic. It requires organization, solidarity, and struggle against those who benefit from the current order. The ruling class will resist, for the redistribution of control threatens their wealth, their status, and their capacity to dictate social norms. Therefore, the workers must act collectively, recognizing their shared interest and shared power, understanding that only through coordinated effort can the mechanisms of exploitation be dismantled. True freedom is inseparable from collective action, as the liberation of one worker is inseparable from the liberation of all, and as the structures that constrain human life are systemic, not personal. Seizing control of production also entails democratization of decision-making, so that labor is not only performed but directed by those who perform it. Hierarchical control, where decisions are imposed from above, mirrors the coercion and alienation of capitalism. True freedom requires participatory structures in which workers, communities, and citizens determine the allocation of resources, the organization of labor, and the priorities of society. Such democratization ensures that economic power does not merely shift from one elite to another, but becomes a vehicle for human emancipation, accountable to the collective rather than concentrated in private hands. The fruits of labor are returned to the producers, and society itself becomes responsive to the needs, aspirations, and creativity of its members. Human needs extend beyond material requirements to include education, cultural participation, health, and social connection. A society oriented toward these needs recognizes that labor is not simply a means to an end, but a component of human development and social cohesion. When production serves human needs, individuals are empowered to pursue fulfillment rather than mere survival, relationships are strengthened rather than fragmented, and communities are enriched rather than exploited. Work becomes meaningful not because it generates profit, but because it contributes to collective life, human dignity, and the potential of every member of society. Ultimately, freedom under capitalism is an illusion because the structure of production, ownership, and profit determines who lives freely and who labors in subjugation. True freedom is inseparable from the social and economic control of the tools, resources, and systems that shape life. By seizing production, organizing collectively, and reorienting society toward human needs rather than profit, the oppressed can reclaim their lives, restore human dignity, and construct a world in which labor is a source of fulfillment, creativity, and equality rather than exploitation, alienation, and deprivation. The realization of this freedom is both an act of justice and a revolution in the very meaning of human existence, transforming society so that people, not profit, dictate the course of their own lives and the collective destiny of humanity. Comrades, we have seen the truth laid bare. The chains that bind you, though invisible, are real. They are woven from ideology, from economic dependence, and from the structures of a system that thrives on your labor while denying your humanity. We have examined how capitalism exploits every hour of effort, every ounce of creativity, and every aspiration, converting your life into profit. For the few, while alienating you from yourselves, your communities, and the very act of labor that defines your existence. We have recognized that understanding this oppression is not enough without consciousness, and that awakening to the reality of systemic exploitation is the spark that lights the fire of liberation. Yet recognition alone does not free us. Freedom comes from action, from solidarity, from the unity of the oppressed rising together to confront the structures that exploit them. It is only when we organize, when we unite across workplaces, neighborhoods, and industries, that our collective strength can challenge and dismantle the power of those who would profit from our subjugation. The path of liberation is not given, it must be seized through deliberate, courageous, and sustained effort. It is in our unity that we reclaim our labor, our time, our dignity, and our lives. True freedom demands more than the reform of institutions or the redistribution of charity. It requires the transformation of society itself, the seizure of production, the democratization of decision-making, and the construction of a world where human needs, not profit, dictate every action, every priority, and every policy. In this society, labor is not a burden to be exploited, but a tool of empowerment, creativity, and fulfillment. Wealth, once concentrated in the hands of a few, is returned to those who generate it, and the structures that perpetuate inequality are replaced by those that nurture equality, justice, and the flourishing of every individual. Comrades, the chains that are unseen are the ones that bind the most, but they can also be broken by consciousness, by unity, and by collective struggle. The power to reshape society rests not in the hands of the rulers, but in the hands of those who produce its wealth, those whose labor sustains its life. Rise, organize, and act, for the world you deserve is not distant or imaginary. It is within your grasp. Your labor, your solidarity, and your courage are the instruments of revolution, the tools with which you will dismantle exploitation, reclaim your humanity, and build a society where freedom is real, universal, and inseparable from the life of the collective. The invisible chains can be shattered, but only if you see them, understand them, and refuse to serve them any longer. Stand together, act together, and let the force of the many overturn the power of the few. In this struggle lies not only justice, but the true liberation of humanity, the reclamation of life, and the dawn of a society where human needs, dignity, and freedom are the measure of all things. The time to act is now, for history belongs to those who dare to recognize their chains and shatter them through unity, courage, and collective power.